Hi, my name is Rithwik, and I'll take you through some topics around targets, baselines, and data sources. So let's begin with a metaphor of a journey. Right? All projects that you do are taking you from one situation to another. It's a journey from a situation to another. So it might help if we have this metaphor of a journey in our minds to understand these ideas around measuring, evaluation, monitoring. It might help to have this metaphor in mind to get these ideas to stick. And when it doesn't, you can think back to this metaphor uh, to remind yourself of the basics, or to understand why exactly you're doing this, right? So let's say you're going from A to B, right? If you're taking a car from A to B, there are various ways of doing this, various ways of going there. You could take a straight road, and uh, there's no wastage, fastest way, right? But you could end up going this way. You go zig and then you zag, go here and there, and then eventually, although you reach B, you have wasted a lot of your resources, your time, fuel, things like that. Or you could, if you really didn't know where you're starting from, you could end up at the same position. And this is the sort of thing that happens when sometimes people are left alone in the desert and they don't have anything to orient on. They don't have any landmarks, and they end up going around in circles. So it's quite important to know where you are, important to know where you want to go to, and important to know how you would know you're making progress and how fast you're making progress and things. Right? So this is the metaphor of the journey. And so where you want to go to is your target. Why you want to go there is your goal. Where you are at, that's your baseline. What should you keep an eye on? Those are your metrics and data. Those are the things that you're looking at, right? So when you're taking a car, maybe you're looking at Google Maps, maybe you're looking at a physical map, maybe you're looking at the dashboard, the speed, the time that you have been traveling. All of these things contribute to the sense of where you are and how you're making progress towards your goal. Equivalent things you will do in a project. You might look at dashboards in Excel or Power BI or Tableau, or you might get your hands dirty with code. You might sit and analyze things in R or Python or SQL. So that's where metrics and data, that's how you lead this journey. And how would you know if you're making progress? That is the monitoring bit. So monitoring is happening during the journey. While you're on your journey, you're looking at these metrics, you're looking at where you are and how you're making progress. And the evaluation half is after you reach B. You think back on how you made your journey. Was there anything that you could have done differently? What went well? What didn't? That's the evaluation thing. And this helps you to do your future journeys in a better way. So that's our metaphor. You can keep it in your mind and relate back to this whenever you want to. With that in mind, let's start with targets. So like we said, it's very important to know where you are going to, what your goal is, and how you would know if you're making progress towards it. Or are you going astray, you're going off the road. So it becomes necessary to understand to define what metric you would use and what target for that metric you would be using as a target. So let's start with this example, right? Which is a better company, do you think, when you look at this table of metrics? The metric here is sales growth percentage, and we are comparing these two companies, Alpha and Bravo. Which is the better company here? You can pause your video if you wish and think about it. Okay. So immediately it seems that Bravo is the better company, right? Because it has grown 100%. It has doubled its sales. But what if I tell you that the sales revenue was this? Right. So Alpha had a very high sales revenue, while Bravo just had $10,000. And this is what it doubled. Now, does your evaluation of these companies change? Think about the company you would want to own at this point if you want to. And you could have various metrics of this sort, right? And at each point, if you think about it, your evaluation of the companies might be different. And this is why it's important to decide beforehand what metric are you going to use. Let's say, like, if you're looking at the profit margin, Bravo seems the better company. This has a very low profit margin. But when I say profit margin, it is out of the revenue that you are making, what percentage of it is your profit after you pay off your the costs that you have. Right? Then you look at the head count and you say that, oh, this was made by only 4 people and therefore this is better. So each of these metrics, if you look at it in isolation, you might come to a certain conclusion about which company is better. Maybe you look at it in a combination of metrics. But however you do, this is important. This is an important step because you wouldn't know, like, unless you define this beforehand, it's just a matter of opinion. You could keep having debates amongst your colleagues, and you wouldn't come to a conclusion because you have not decided what your target was before. So as we can see, the evaluation of which company is better is very dependent on the metric that you choose. But then how do we choose the metric? The right metric is the one which aligns to the goal that you chose. If your goal was to grow as fast as you can, maybe the percentage revenue was the right metric. If your goal was to become the biggest company in terms of headcount, the headcount is your metric. So whatever your goal is, that determines what metrics you would pick. And you have a lot of metrics to pick from. You can come up with your own. You have standard metrics that people use. We'll talk about that later in this session. Right now, as an exercise, you can pause this video and think about any goal that you want to achieve, which could also be a personal goal, for example, reading 10 books in this year. And for that goal, come up with a list of metrics that you would track. Now, different metrics do different things. They serve different purposes. So we'll look at a couple of types of metrics. This is one of these big classification that you can have: leading and lagging metrics. Leading metrics are the ones that tell you how you're doing. This is more useful in the monitoring context. And then according to what you see, you take actions to ensure your success. So if you have, if you notice on your dashboard that you are going slow, you can increase your speed. So the speed and the distance you have traveled is sort of your leading metric. The lagging metric in the case of the car journey would be the time that you reach, the eventual arrival time. So these tell you how you did after a milestone is completed. This is useful in the evaluation context. So at that point, you can think about what went right or wrong and take your learnings into your next project. If you had come up with a list of metrics for whatever goal you wanted to achieve, now you can pause and think about which of those were leading and lagging metrics. It is advised to have both types of them. If you don't have leading metrics, you do not know how you're doing while you're doing it. And then it's just a vanity metric. You can track it, but none of your actions will be influenced by them. So it is advised to have some leading metrics so that you can course correct when you need to, and then lagging metrics to know if you reach the place or not. So if you had picked the reading books goal, maybe a leading metric would be how many pages did I read today, right? And the lagging metric is, of course, how many books you managed to read at the end of the year. Yeah. This is another way of classifying, or it's just a way of thinking about what metrics you would be using. So some metrics are standard metrics, right? Like when we are talking about the car journey, speed, distance, all of these immediately come to our minds. Now, speed itself is like distance by time, right? So it's a metric that is used quite frequently by everyone, and that would be like a standard metric. Pages per day, like these are standard metrics that immediately come to people's minds, come to all the stakeholders' minds who are dealing with a particular project. So this saves time in design because you don't need to think about how you're going to define a particular metric. And you have accepted definitions for them, and they are oftentimes you have measurement systems in place for the same. And since a stakeholder is also familiar with the metric, you have more time, you have more credibility there, and then you can talk about more important things rather than what metric to use. You can also have specific or contextual indicators, which means, so for instance, let's say you're running a website, right? A standard metric might be how many users are using your site, how many users logged into a site or something. While a specific some custom metric that you design might take into account your business model, and then you might decide that you are not really interested in number of logins, but how much time they spend, how much time a particular person spends on your website before doing his first transaction, something like that. Now that's very, it could be, the custom metric could be of any complexity. It's designed to serve you. Often you use both of them, it's a combination of these two, to give you a more bigger picture of what's going on. And all of these metrics, they are put together into broadly two sorts of artifacts. You could have reports, or you could have dashboards. The reports are static; they are not interactive. They are defined before time, and they're generated with the defined procedure. So this might be a mail that is sent out to people. This might be a PDF that gets attached to the mail. Right? While dashboards are more dynamic, they are more interactive. So this is what a Tableau or a click view and things like that would be. So you can click around, you can investigate particular subsets of the data, you can filter down, you can group things and see. So basically, it gives you more amount of interaction with the data that lies underneath. So this would be some examples of a report, right? It could be a medical report, and that's why they are called reports, right? It's a blood report or a test report. So things like that. You're not typically interacting with the data itself. It is presented to you in a static way. And on the other hand, you have dashboards, which might look like this, and people would be able to click on these things where you are selecting a particular project. Maybe you're clicking on a particular bar here, and then everything else gets filtered down to that particular subset of the data. It could be in Excel too. So these are widgets added to an Excel spreadsheet, and these gauges would change according to the data that is present on the other sheet probably. So this would be a dashboard, but if you print it out into a PDF, take a screenshot of it, send it over email, that's your procedure. That would be a report. We'll move on to baselines now. So like we talked about when we were talking about the car journey, it is important that you know where you are so that you don't end up in circles, going around in circles. You know where you are, so that you can compare to that once you're done with the project. So for example, if you saw 100% improvement in sales this year, this would be the end point of your project, right? This, or whatever time period you're looking at. If you saw 100% improvement, the question is, are we doing good from an evaluation perspective? But would we really know unless we know where we were before that? What if our sales was $1 and then we doubled it? What it was 1 million? That is really good because you went to 2 million. So the point being, if you don't know where you are, you have no way of comparing once you're done with your project. And it can often lead to these base rate fallacies, because let's say you chose your metric as percentage improvement and you see a really high number here, but that is only because your initial amount was quite low. And that is what is called base rate fallacy in the literature. And this is a definition of baseline from the textbook that is being used for the course, IFRC M&D guide. The key terms would be analysis describing the initial conditions against which progress can be assessed or comparisons made. So that is what it is in quite simple terms. It is just figuring out where you are so that once the project ends, you can have the comparison assessments, things like that. And at that point, it's called an endline studies in the literature, when you measure how we measure the situation at the end of the project or the program. So then if you look at it, it's like a 3-step procedure, right? You make initial measurements and you call it baselines. And you take final measurements, you call it end lines, and then you make rigorous comparisons. And that is where some of these statistical techniques that you would come across in different modules would help. So you can do a hypothesis test to really say that these two values of the same metric that you had decided across time has changed, and it's not just a random change. It is a statistically significant change. That is what hypothesis testing would tell you. You have, and this is what, in essence, an experiment is. You have some state of the world, you make a change to it, and then you see what effect it had. Right? Yeah. So you will run into these statistical techniques, and this is where it will be useful. So you can refer to the hypothesis testing and statistical computing modules for more information there. move on to data sources now. So if you look at we've been talking about metrics and baselines, but how do you collect those metrics? So in the case of the car, when we are talking about, let's say the metrics chosen is speed, but how do you get to the speed? So there is some sensor in the car which is counting the rotations of the wheel over time and something like that. So you have that sensor is your data source. So when you're talking about the real world, when you're talking about your project, you can have lots of different sensors. If they could be primary, they could be secondary. So if you're collecting your data yourself, that would be a primary source. While if you're relying on secondary data sources, like let's say you want to learn about a particular market, particular country's economy, and then you get reports and data from the World Bank or the IMF. So those would be secondary sources. Secondary sources are very nice because you have outsourced your effort to someone else. But just be careful that they are relevant to your problem, and they're reliable sources. You could also, there's another way of thinking about the data that you collect, are quantitative and qualitative data. You can collect your data in various ways. There is a current bias towards quantitative things, surveys and Excel sheets and numbers and so on, where but you can also look at qualitative data sources where you talk to people, get their stories, and this is what essentially designers do. Qualitative interviews, focus groups, or user studies, things like those are qualitative studies. And the best insights are got when you sort of combine both of these. So you have quantitative data of how people are using your website, let's say, but you also have user studies. You also observe the people using your website in real time and the problems that they're facing while they do it. So at the end of it, whatever metrics and indicators you choose, just be careful that you're using the same ones for comparing the baseline and the end line, because otherwise you run into the comparing apples and oranges problem. And before we close out the presentation, just some thoughts about measuring itself. Measuring is a fascinating field. Lots of people have thought about it. Lots of people have talked about it. If you just Google, you'll have lots of different quotes about measuring things, about measurement itself. So I'll leave you a few quotes just to just some food for thought. You can just think about it. So sometimes measuring is not serving your purposes as well. So you can think about, do people change their behavior in response to the awareness of being observed? And then, which means that your measurement is not the real thing. Or you can think about the social effects of instituting a measurement over a group, because when that becomes a target, people find ways to game the target. So there are these different quotes, and you can just go through them when you have time. So Deming is another figure who you would definitely run across when talking about measurement, because he is the one who supposedly has said one of the most famous lines in measurement, that in God we trust, all others bring data. But actually, if you look at what Deming has said, he has also talked about being skeptical about just numbers, right? Being actually look at what is happening in the system. So yeah, and he actually was a proponent of using things like this chart. This is called a control chart. Whatever metric you're tracking, you might want to ignore random variations in the metric. Let's say it's just production of whatever you are creating over time. A certain amount of variation is natural. It's a random variation of the system, but you do not want to intervene when these random variations happen. This was like one of the central points of what Deming used to talk about. You only want to intervene when it crosses the bounds. So this is a control chart. If you're interested, you can read more about it. It's basically these dotted lines. Whatever stays within it is systemic variation, and you do not need to worry about it. You shouldn't intervene into the system and mess things up. And finally, these are some resources, some books that talk about measurement and take different views, different things that we talked about. So how to measure anything, really good book about how you can quantify things, measure it, make decisions on top of it. So it's a really good book, and the central premise of it is how to, like, you can measure anything, even the intangibles. And the second book, The Tyranny of Metrics, talks about what we just spoke about, right? That the metrics themselves, the measurements and managing by numbers themselves can set you back in some ways, in some counterintuitive ways. If you're interested about it, you can read about that. And we also talked about quantitative and qualitative measurement. This is a book which goes into that, about how and why you should also include qualitative studies into whatever you're trying to measure. So that's it. I hope you found that somewhat useful at least. Thank you.